The gauge at Station 8536110, Cape May, New Jersey, has not recorded a high tide since Tuesday morning. I've pulled the data from 3 separate terminals. 41 hours ago, the water level sensor registered a normal ebb at 6:14 a.m. The column dropped to 0.3 feet below MLLW, and then it stayed there. According to every instrument at that station, the tide went out and never came back. But I've been standing on the municipal pier since sunrise, and the harbor is 4 feet above the dock planks. The fishing boats along the T-wharf are straining at their cleats, hulls pressed sideways against the pilings, and a crab pot float I watched at dawn is now completely submerged. The water is still rising, and the gauge still says it isn't. My name is Dan Whitfield. I'm a field maintenance contractor for the National Ocean Service, the division of NOAA that manages the National Tide Observation Network. I've held the contract for the Mid-Atlantic coastal stations for 11 years, Cape May, Lewis, Atlantic City, Sandy Hook, and the backup stations in between. My job is not glamorous. I drive a white government tag pickup between stations. I inspect enclosures, I swap sensors, I run calibration checks, and I file condition reports. When a gauge malfunctions, I'm the one they call. When the data looks wrong, I'm the one who's supposed to make it look right. I arrived in Cape May on Wednesday evening after a call from the regional coordinator, a woman named Peggy Holt, who works out of the Silver Spring office. Peggy's been with the service for 20-something years, and she doesn't waste words. She said, "Station 8536110 has been flatlined at low datum for 31 hours. The backup sensor agrees. We need eyes on it tonight." I told her I could be there by 7. She said fine, and then she said something I almost missed because I was already reaching for my keys. "Dan, the harbor master called us, not the other way around. He says the water's up. If that's true, I need you to document the discrepancy before you touch anything. Don't recalibrate first. Document first." That was unusual. Normally, Peggy just wants the station back online. She doesn't care about documenting what went wrong. She cares about the fix, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The drive from my apartment in Toms River took a little over 2 hours. Route 9 south through Barnegat, past the long flat stretches of Pine Barrens, then across the causeway at Great Egg Harbor, where you can smell the salt even with the windows up. By the time I reached the Cape May Peninsula, it was dark. The town has a strange quality at night in the off-season. All those big Victorian houses lit from the inside, gingerbread trim catching the streetlights, but almost nobody on the sidewalks. The tourism season was still 3 months away. The harbor district was quieter still, a few lights on in the lobster house. The ferry terminal dark except for its security floods. The Coast Guard station showing its usual red over white. I parked at the municipal pier lot and walked out to the tide station first, before checking in with anyone. The station enclosure is a fiberglass shelter about the size of a phone booth, bolted to the concrete at the end of the commercial fishing pier. Inside, there's the primary acoustic sensor, a transducer mounted inside a 6-inch PVC stilling well that drops straight into the water below. There's a backup pressure sensor. There's a data collection platform, the DCP, which is basically a ruggedized computer that logs the readings every 6 minutes and transmits them via satellite. There's a solar panel on top, a battery backup, and an antenna. Nothing fancy. I've serviced 100 of these. The first thing I did was check the stilling well. I unscrewed the inspection cap and shone my flashlight down the pipe. What I expected to see. If the gauge was malfunctioning, it was either a blockage, marine growth clogging the intake ports, sediment buildup, or a cracked pipe, something physical that would explain why the sensor was reading a static low level. What I actually saw was water, clean, dark water, sitting at a level that looked about right for mid-tide, maybe a 1.5 feet below the rim of the well, moving slightly, alive. I checked the DCP readout. The screen showed the current water level, minus 0.27 feet mmLLW. According to the instrument, the water in the stilling well was sitting nearly 2 feet lower than what I was seeing with my own eyes. I stood there for a minute. I've seen sensor failures, I've seen transducer drift, I've seen condensation fool an acoustic sensor, I've seen barnacles grow over a pressure port and lock a reading in place. But the sensor is supposed to measure the actual water inside the well, and the water inside the well is connected to the harbor through the intake ports. If the water in the harbor is high, the water in the well should be high. If the sensor disagrees with the physical water level, the sensor is broken. That's the only explanation. That's always the only explanation. I pulled up the 6-minute data log on my laptop, plugging directly into the DCP's serial port. The log confirmed what Peggy had said. At 06:14 on Tuesday, the level began to drop. Normal tidal ebb. It reached minus 0.31 feet at 08:48, normal low tide. Then it flatlined. Minus 0.29, minus 0.27, minus 0.31, minus 0.28. For over 40 hours, the readings had been hovering within a 0.04 of a foot band around low tide datum. No flood, no ebb, no tidal signal at all. Just a flat line, gently drifting like background noise. I pulled up the backup pressure sensor's log. Same story, flatlined at low datum since Tuesday morning. Both sensors agreed. I closed the laptop, locked the enclosure, and walked to the edge of the pier. The harbor was dark, but the dock lights gave me enough to see the waterline on the pilings. Every piling in that harbor has a growth line, a visible band of barnacles and algae that marks the average high water mark. The water was at least a foot above that line. I could see it clearly. Some of the lower dock cleats were underwater. A section of the floating dock near the fuel pump had risen so high that the gangway ramp was nearly horizontal. Those ramps are designed to accommodate a 6-foot tidal range, and this one was almost maxed out. Something was wrong, obviously. But the nature of what was wrong didn't make sense yet. 2 independent sensors, measuring the same stilling well, were both reading low tide. The physical water level in the well looked normal to high. The harbor was visibly above high water marks. It was like the instruments had agreed to lie, or like the water had found a way to rise without the sensors noticing. I called Peggy. It was close to 10 p.m., but she'd told me to call regardless of the hour. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm at the station," I said. "Both sensors read low. The well looks mid-tide or higher. The harbor is well above normal high water." Silence for a moment. "How far above?" "A foot, maybe 18 inches above the barnacle line on the pilings. I'd guess we're sitting at about 7 feet LLW if I had to eyeball it." "And the DCP says?" "Minus 0.27. That's a 7-foot discrepancy, Dan." "I know. Is the stilling well blocked?" "No, clear water. I can see it moving." More silence. Then, "Okay, run a full calibration check. Swap the transducer if you have a spare. I'm going to pull the data from Lewis and Atlantic City and see if they're showing anything unusual. Call me when you finish." I told her I would. Before I hung up, I asked if the harbor master was still around. She said he'd called from a cell phone earlier that day, and hadn't answered when Silver Spring tried to call back. She gave me his name, Carl Deaver. I said I'd try to find him in the morning. The calibration check took about an hour. The process is straightforward. You lower a graduated staff into the stilling well, read the actual water level manually, and compare it to what the sensor reports. If there's a discrepancy, you adjust the sensor offset until the readings match. I've done this hundreds of times. Most of the time, you find that the sensor has drifted 1/10 of a foot, maybe 2/10. You adjust, you note it in the log, you move on. I lowered the staff. The physical water level in the well was 4.12 feet above the sensor datum. That's solidly above mean high water for Cape May. Basically, the well was telling me the same thing the harbor was telling me. The water was abnormally high. The sensor was reading minus 0.27, a discrepancy of 4 feet and 4/10 of a foot. That's not drift. That's not a condensation. That's not anything I've seen in 11 years. A discrepancy that large would mean the sensor is completely non-functional, just outputting a static number. But both sensors were showing slight variation. They were responding to something. They just weren't responding to the water. I swapped the acoustic transducer anyway. I had a spare in the truck. Pulled the old one, mounted the new one, let it initialize. The new transducer ran through its startup diagnostic, passed, and then reported a water level of minus 0.24 feet, MLLW. I stared at the readout for a long time. A brand new sensor, freshly installed, was giving me the same wrong answer. It was measuring the water in the same stilling well, but it was telling me that water was 4 feet lower than it actually was, as if the sound pulse was traveling down the well, hitting the surface, bouncing back, and measuring a distance that didn't correspond to where the water actually sat. Or as if the water that the sensor was measuring wasn't the same water I was looking at. I didn't let myself think about that. Not yet. I packed up my tools, drove to the motel on Lafayette Street, checked in, and tried to sleep. The room faced the harbor. I left the window cracked because the heat was stuck on high and the thermostat didn't respond. Through the opening, I could hear the water against the seawall, a steady, unhurried lapping that sounded wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. It took me 20 minutes of lying there in the dark before I figured it out. The rhythm. Waves lap at a rate that corresponds to wind and tide and harbor geometry. This sound had no variation. Every lap was identical to the one before it. Same interval, same volume, same duration, like a recording on loop. I got up and closed the window. By Thursday morning, the water in the harbor was higher, not dramatically, maybe 3 or 4 inches, but enough that the floating dock at the fuel station was now sitting almost level with the fixed pier. A few of the lower finger piers in the marina were awash. The sky was overcast, a flat gray ceiling that sat about 500 feet up and turned the whole peninsula into a box of muted light. No wind at all. The surface of the harbor was glassy, perfectly still, except for the tiny, metronomic lapping against the bulkheads. I went back to the tide station and checked the DCP. The overnight log showed the same flat line, minus 0.31, minus 0.28, minus 0.26, minus 0.29. The new transducer hadn't changed anything. The backup pressure sensor still agreed. I called Peggy at 7:30. She sounded like she'd been up for a while. "Lewis is normal," she said. "Atlantic City is normal. Sandy Hook is normal." I checked the entire Mid-Atlantic network. Every station from Montauk to Norfolk is showing normal tidal signals. Cape May is the only anomaly. "That doesn't make sense," I said. Cape May isn't a closed system. It's open ocean on one side, Delaware Bay on the other. If the water's high here, Lewis should see it too. They're across the same bay. I know. Did you check the port's current data, the bay current sensors? Normal flow, normal tidal exchange. Everything upstream and downstream of Cape May looks textbook. Then how is the water high here? Peggy didn't answer for a moment. I don't know. I want you to do a manual survey. Walk the water line. Check the other reference marks, the staff gauge on the ferry pier, the benchmark on the Coast Guard station bulkhead. See if the rise is uniform across the harbor or localized. And Dan, take photos. Time-stamped. I said I would. Then I asked if she'd reached the harbor master. She said no. Carl Deaver wasn't answering his phone, and his office at the marina was closed. She'd tried the Cape May police non-emergency line, and the officer she spoke with said Deaver was probably fishing and offered to take a message. The manual survey took most of the morning. I walked the entire harbor perimeter, from the Coast Guard station at the inlet, along the commercial fishing pier, past the lobster house and the marina, around to the ferry terminal, and back along Beach Avenue to the sea wall that faces the open Atlantic. I checked every reference mark I knew about, and 2 I found in the station records that I hadn't visited before. The results were consistent. The water was high everywhere, not just in the harbor. Along the ocean beach, the water line was 30 to 40 feet higher up the sand than it should have been for a normal tide cycle. The beach at the foot of the promenade, which is normally 60 or 70 yards wide at low tide, was maybe 30 yards. And the wave action on the ocean side was wrong too. The same metronomic quality I'd heard from my motel room. Small uniform waves arriving at perfectly regular intervals, like something was pushing them from very far away with mechanical precision. The staff gauge on the ferry pier, a simple painted ruler bolted to a piling, read 7.6 feet. High tide at Cape May normally peaks around 5.5 feet. I was looking at 2 feet of unexplained water with no tidal source, no storm surge, no wind, no upstream event, and 2 federal instruments insisting it wasn't there. I took 47 photographs with my phone, every reference mark, the staff gauge, the submerged cleats, the floating dock, the beach width, the still glassy water with its metronome waves, each photo automatically embedded with GPS coordinates and a timestamp. When I got back to the truck, I sat in the cab and scrolled through the images. They all looked exactly like what I'd seen. I uploaded them to the shared drive that Peggy and I used for field reports. Then I opened the upload log to confirm they'd transferred. The log showed 47 files uploaded. I opened the first one, the staff gauge photo. The image loaded. It showed the staff gauge, clearly legible, but the reading in the photograph was 1.2 feet. Low tide. I looked at my phone. On my phone, the same photo showed 7.6 feet. On the shared drive, it showed 1.2. I opened the next photo, a shot of the submerged dock cleats. On my phone, the cleats were underwater, green harbor water lapping over the galvanized steel. On the shared drive, the cleats were dry, sitting 3 inches above a calm, low water line. I went through all 47. Every single photograph had changed, not in composition. The framing, the angle, the lighting were all identical, but the water level in every image had dropped. As if someone had taken my photographs and digitally altered the water to match what the tide gauge was reporting. I didn't call Peggy. I thought about how that conversation would go. The photos changed when I uploaded them. She'd think I was confused. She'd think I was having some kind of episode. I've seen what happens to contractors who sound unreliable. They lose their contracts. 11 years of work gone because someone at Silver Spring decides you're a liability. So instead of calling, I drove to the Cape May Public Library on Lafayette Street, 3 blocks from my motel. The librarian directed me to the local history room on the 2nd floor. They had a collection of Coast Survey documents donated by a retired NOAA employee sometime in the 1990s, mostly bound logbooks, photographic records, and correspondence. The logbooks were organized by year. I started with the most recent and worked backward. The entries were what you'd expect. Monthly summaries of title, datums, maintenance notes, sensor replacements, benchmark surveys. Routine. I was looking for any mention of anomalous readings, extended low tide periods, or discrepancies between observed and recorded levels. I found it in a logbook from 1991. The entry was written in neat, slanted handwriting, the kind of penmanship that people used to learn in school and that nobody bothers with anymore. It was dated March 14, 1991, and it was signed by a field technician named R. Castillo. Station 8536110. Acoustic gauge reading low datum for approximately 22 hours. Physical observation indicates water level at or above MHW. Backup tide staff confirms visual observation. Contacted regional office. Advised to recalibrate and resume normal operations. Recalibration performed. Note: calibration adjusted sensor to match observed level. Within 4 hours, sensor returned to low datum reading. Second recalibration performed. Same result. Harbormaster E. Pruitt reports water higher than he's ever seen it in 30 years. Contacted regional office again. Advised to replace sensor assembly and submit anomalous data flag. Replaced sensor. New sensor also reads low datum. Departing station pending further guidance. Below that entry, in different handwriting. Heavier, more hurried. Someone had added a single line. Per Regional Directive 03-91-7. All data from Station 8536110 for the period March 12 to 18, 1991 has been excluded from the published record. Sensor malfunction. No further action. I sat back in the wooden library chair and read both entries again. Then a third time. The pattern was almost identical to what I was experiencing. Extended low reading, high water, recalibration fails. New sensor gives the same wrong answer, and then a directive to exclude the data entirely, to erase it. I checked the logbooks for other years. In 1978, I found a brief note, less detailed, almost cryptic. Station reading low, harbor high, 2 days, resolved per standing procedure. No elaboration, no signature. In 2003, a longer entry by a technician whose name I couldn't fully read. The first initial was J. The last name started with war, and the rest was smudged. This one mentioned something the others hadn't. Harbor master advises that local fishing crews are refusing to leave the harbor. Captains report that navigational buoys in the inlet are submerged despite charts showing adequate clearance. Note: GPS returns position normally, but depth sounder reads inconsistently. Some captains report depth readings matching the gauge, shallow/low, rather than observed conditions, deep/high. Request guidance. The response added in a different pen. Data excluded per standard protocol. Equipment serviced. No navigational advisory issued. I closed the logbook. 3 incidents spanning 30 years. Same station, same contradiction. Each time, the official response was the same. Call it a malfunction, exclude the data, and move on. No investigation, no explanation, no advisory to the mariners who were apparently seeing the same thing I was seeing. I turned the page back to the 1991 entry. Then I turned to the page before Castillo's, dated March 12th, 1991, written in yet another hand. This one blocky, all capitals. Station 8536110 Harbormaster E. Pruitt reports waterline at ferry terminal has exceeded 1962, benchmark by 14 inches. Gauge reads low datum, contacted NOS Regional Office, Field Tech R. Castillo assigned. Note from E. Pruitt, dictated. This happened before 1978, and before that, harbormen know. The water inside the inlet is not the same water outside. During events, the harbor fills with something that reads as water, looks like water, acts like water, but does not follow the tide. The gauge knows the difference. The gauge has always known the difference. The gauge is not broken. The gauge is the only thing keeping the water from knowing what it is. Do not correct the gauge. If the gauge reports low tide, the water believes it is low tide. If you tell the gauge the water is high, the water will know it is high, and then it will act like high water. And there is no high water mark for this water. There is no limit. I read E. Pruitt's dictated note 3 times. The gauge is the only thing keeping the water from knowing what it is. I thought about Harlan's words. The gauge isn't lying to you. And when someone corrected the gauge to match the water matched the gauge. In 1978, when someone forced the gauge to read high, the harbor drained itself in 3 minutes. Because the water, this other water, believed the gauge. If the gauge said low, the water stayed manageable, creeping, slow, contained. If the gauge said high, the water understood that it was high, and it behaved accordingly, and there was no limit. The gauge wasn't measuring the water. The gauge was restraining it. I ran. The night air outside was thick, not with fog, but with something that had the weight of fog without the visibility. The sky was clear now, the overcast having broken up sometime in the last hour, and the stars were out. But the air was heavy, saturated, as if the moisture in the harbor had started climbing upward without forming clouds. I drove to the pier. The water had risen another 6 inches in the time I had been gone. The concrete pad around the enclosure was wet. The base of the fiberglass shelter was sitting in a 1/4 inch of perfectly still water. The lapping had stopped. The harbor was completely silent, not calm, silent. There's a difference. Calm water still moves, still makes sound, still has the restless energy of a living system connected to an ocean and a sky and a wind. This water was motionless, perfectly flat, as if it were waiting. I opened the enclosure. The DCP screen still showed my name. Operator. Whitfield. D. Status. On station. Next scheduled service. Pending. Do not adjust calibration. The water level reading. Mine is 0.18 feet. Still low tide. Still holding. I understood now what the gauge was doing. It was lying to the water. Every 6 minutes, it sampled the surface of the stilling well and reported a number that had nothing to do with reality and the water. This water, whatever it was, accepted the number as truth. The gauge said low tide, and the water believed it was low tide even as it rose. It rose because something was pushing it, filling the harbor from below or within, but it rose slowly, gently, within bounds, because it didn't know how high it really was. The gauge kept it ignorant. And if I corrected the gauge, if I entered the real number, the 7+ feet that my staff reading showed, the water would know, It would know it was 7 feet above datum, and it would act like 7 feet above datum, and then 8 and 10 and 20. Because this water didn't follow the moon. It followed the gauge. And once the gauge admitted the truth, there was no telling what the truth would become. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was a single line. "You're still on station. Good. Don't leave until it ebbs. RC. RCR Castillo, the 1991 technician who didn't exist in any database, who had come here 35 years ago, done exactly what I was doing, and then, what? Disappeared, like Carl Deaver? Or become part of the system, like my name in the contractor records?" I didn't respond. I stood in the enclosure with water seeping across the concrete floor, watching the DCP log its readings every 6 minutes. -0.19, -0.21, -0.18. The numbers drifting in their narrow band, whispering low tide to the dark water filling the harbor. Around midnight, the water reached my boots. I stepped up onto the battery bank. A heavy steel shelf bolted to the wall of the enclosure, about 10 inches off the floor. The water continued to rise, slow and patient and absolutely silent, and the gauge continued to lie. At 2 in the morning, the water was ankle deep inside the enclosure. The DCP was mounted high enough to stay dry, but the cable runs along the floor were submerged. The instruments kept working. The satellite antenna on the roof kept transmitting. Every 6 minutes, the gauge told the world and the water that the tide at Cape May was low. At 4, I felt something change, not in the water level. That was still creeping up, just past my shins now, but in the quality of the water itself. It was warmer, noticeably warmer than harbor water should be in April, and it had a faint luminescence, not a glow exactly, but a quality of holding light, the way a pearl holds light, so that the surface seemed fractionally brighter than the air above it. I could see my reflection in it, and my reflection was looking up at me with an expression I wasn't wearing. I looked away. At 5:15, the water stopped rising. I felt it happen, a subtle shift in pressure, as if something that had been pushing from below had relaxed. The surface settled. The perfectly timed lapping returned, but softer now, almost gentle. And then, slowly, the water began to drop. The DCP registered it. The reading ticked from -0.18 to -0.22, then -0.31, then -0.44. The gauge was recording an ebb, a real tidal ebb, moving in the right direction for the first time in 3 days. And the water was following, receding, draining back through the inlet in a steady, unhurried flow that I could see in the way the debris on the surface began to drift outward. By sunrise, the water was below the concrete pad. By 7, the harbor looked almost normal. The floating dock had dropped back to its usual position. The cleats were dry. The growth line on the pilings marked the water line again. The fishing boats sat at their normal draft. I checked the DCP one final time. The reading: 1.4 feet MLLW. A normal low tide for the time of day. The status line no longer showed my name. The display was back to its standard format: timestamp, water level, battery voltage, transmission status, as if the screen had never known who I was. The drive back to Tom's River took 2.5 hours. I stopped for gas in May's Landing and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, watching the sun come up over the Pine Barrens, trying to reassemble my understanding of things. The world outside the windshield looked normal. Cars passed on the highway. a woman walked a dog across the gas station lot. The radio played a morning show with traffic reports and weather. Normal. I filed my report that afternoon. Sensor malfunction at station 8536110. Transducer replaced. Data from the affected period excluded from the published record. No navigational advisory required. All systems nominal. Peggy acknowledged the report with a 2-word email. Thank you. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the National Ocean Service. Not an email. A physical letter on NOS letterhead delivered to my apartment. It informed me that my contract had been renewed for another 5-year term, beginning immediately. The letter referenced my 11 years of exemplary service and my consistent professionalism during the March 2026 Cape May maintenance event. Stapled to the back of the letter was a single sheet of paper, a list of dates, future dates, stretching out to 2041 with a station number next to each one. Station 8536110. Every date was 2 to 4 years apart. Next to each date, in small printed text, expected datum excursion. Field tech on station required. Do not adjust calibration. They'd given me a schedule, not of maintenance visits, but of events, dates when the water would rise again, and I would need to be there to make sure no one told the gauge the truth. At the bottom of the sheet, below the last date, someone had written a note in blue ink. The handwriting was the same neat, slanted script I'd seen in the 1991 logbook. Welcome to the rotation, Dan. You'll do fine. Just watch the gauge and let the water believe what it needs to believe. RC. I keep the letter in my glove compartment. Every morning I check the NOAA tide data for Cape May on my phone. The gauge reads normally. The tides rise and fall on schedule following the moon like they're supposed to. But sometimes, usually around 3 in the morning when I can't sleep, I pull up the raw data feed instead of the published record. And in the raw feed, buried in the 6-minute intervals, I can see it. The readings are always about 1/4 of a foot too low. Not enough to trigger an alert. Not enough for anyone to notice. But consistently, persistently low. As if the gauge is always lying, just a little. As if it's always holding something back. And on those nights, I lie in bed in my apartment in Tom's River, 40 miles from the ocean. And I listen. Because some nights, if it's very quiet, I can hear it. That perfectly timed lapping. Lap, lap, lap. Coming from the bathroom. Coming from the kitchen sink. Coming from the pipes in the walls. The water knows where I live. And every 6 minutes, the gauge at Cape May tells it to stay low. So far, it listens. I'm typing this in my kitchen. The faucet is off. The pipes are still. But if I stop typing and just listen, there, that rhythm. Lap, 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 coming from the drain.